They thought it would be just another easy arrest, a black man, a luxury car, a small town where the law is whatever the powerful say it is. But this time, they made a mistake. Because that man wasn't just another victim. He had a brother, the U.S. Attorney General, and the corrupt system that had thrived in the shadows for decades. It was about to come crashing down. But power doesn't give up without a fight, and when corruption is exposed, those who built it will do anything to silence the truth, even if it means silencing him forever. Will justice come in time? Or will this town claim another innocent man before the truth can be heard? If you're drawn to stories of justice, corruption, and the fight against a broken system, hit subscribe now. These are the stories they don't want you to hear. Now let's go back to where it all started. One lonely road, one routine traffic stop, and the moment that set off a chain reaction no one saw coming. The late afternoon sun stretched long golden streaks across the open highway as Malcolm Reed guided his Mercedes S-Class through the unfamiliar backroads of Blackridge. The car hummed smoothly beneath him, a symbol of the success he had built from nothing. Dressed in a tailored navy suit, with a silk tie that barely loosened after a long day of meetings, Malcolm carried the quiet confidence of a man who had fought for his place in the world. A self-made businessman, a leader, a man who believed in order and logic. He reached for the cup of coffee in his center console, replaying the deal he had just closed. It was a big one, a multi-million-dollar expansion for his logistics firm. Years of grinding, of proving himself in boardrooms where few people looked like him, had led to this moment. And tonight, he was heading home, to celebrate, to finally take a breath. But Malcolm had lived long enough to know that not everyone saw him the way he saw himself. Because to some men, in certain parts of America, he was just a black man behind the wheel of a luxury car. And to them, that was enough. A blue and red flash flickered in his rearview mirror. His grip on the steering wheel tightened. He exhaled slowly, steadying himself. Here we go. At first glance, Blackridge looked like any other quiet southern town. A sleepy main street lined with aging storefronts. A courthouse with an old, sun-bleached American flag swaying lazily in the afternoon breeze. A police station squat and unwelcoming, its dark-tinted windows making it look more like a fortress than a place of public service. But beneath the surface, this town was rotten to the core. For decades, its law enforcement, prosecutors, and judges had operated in perfect sync, not to uphold justice, but to feed innocent people into a machine designed for profit. The formula was simple. Cops pulled over the right kind of targets. Judges ensured convictions no matter the evidence. Private prisons raked in the money, one body at a time. It was a system that thrived on fear, silence, and absolute control. No one fought back. No one dared. Because no one ever won. Until tonight. The hum of Malcolm's Mercedes S-Class was the only sound on the quiet stretch of highway. The GPS had guided him onto this unfamiliar back road, promising a faster route home. Then came the flash of red and blue in his rearview mirror. Malcolm inhaled slowly, steadying himself. Here we go. He signaled and eased onto the gravel shoulder, his movements deliberate, controlled. Through the side mirror, he watched as two officers stepped out of the patrol car. The first one, Lieutenant Travis Boone, moved with the slow confidence of a man who had done this countless times before. His mirrored sunglasses hid his eyes, but Malcolm didn't need to see them to know exactly how this would go. Boone adjusted his belt as he approached, the leather creaking under the weight of his holster. "Evening, sir. License and registration." Malcolm retrieved his wallet. His voice remained steady. "Mind telling me what this is about, officer?" Boone tilted his head toward the back of the car. Broken taillight. Probably didn't notice. Malcolm's grip on the steering wheel tightened. He had checked his lights that morning. Had his car serviced last week. Everything was in perfect working order. But that didn't matter. The game had already begun. "That's strange," Malcolm said evenly. "I just had my car inspected. No issues." Boone smirked. "Well, maybe you hit a bump too hard. These roads can be rough." Through the side mirror, Malcolm caught sight of the second officer, Deputy Carter Decker, circling toward the passenger side, his hand resting on his holster. A silent signal. "Step out of the vehicle for me, sir." Boone's voice was polite, but the weight of authority in it left no room for argument. Malcolm met his gaze. "Am I being detained?" Boone let out a slow sigh, like a teacher tired of explaining the rules. Not yet. Just a routine safety check. Routine. Malcolm had seen this routine before. I'd rather stay in my vehicle, officer. Unless I've committed a crime, I don't consent to a search. Boone clicked his tongue. Now, that's disappointing. A man dressed like you, I expected a little more cooperation. Before Malcolm could respond, Decker moved in fast, yanking the passenger door open. Sir, step out of the car, now. Malcolm swallowed hard. It didn't matter what he said. Didn't matter that he knew his rights. This wasn't about the law. It was about power, and they had it. He took a slow breath and stepped out. The second his feet hit the ground, Decker shoved him against the car, patting him down with rough efficiency. Boone whistled as he leaned into the open driver's door, shaking his head. Let's take a look, just to be safe. No warrant, no probable cause, no need. Malcolm stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, his pulse pounding in his ears. Then, the sound of Velcro ripping. A long, dramatic pause. Boone let out a low whistle. Well, what do we have here? When he stepped back, he held up a clear plastic bag, white powder catching the glow of the patrol car's headlights. Malcolm's stomach dropped. He wanted to shout, to argue, to demand the truth. But what was the point? In this town, truth was whatever they decided it to be. The clatter of handcuffs echoed in the night. Then came the sharp bite of steel against his wrists. Malcolm Reed, you're under arrest for possession of a controlled substance. And just like that, the machine swallowed another man whole. The ride to Blackridge Police Station was silent. Not the kind of silence that felt empty, but the kind that suffocated. Thick, heavy, laced with unspoken warnings. The patrol car rattled over uneven pavement, the red and blue lights above casting jagged streaks against the night. Malcolm sat rigid in the back seat, wrists aching from the too tight cuffs, the cold metal digging into his skin. He kept his breathing steady, his face unreadable. This wasn't the first time he'd been pulled over for nothing. But this was different. This was deliberate. Through the steel partition, Boone's voice was casual, almost amused. You ever been inside our jail, Mr. Reed? Malcolm didn't answer. Gonna be a long night, Boone continued, glancing at him in the mirror. Might as well get comfortable. The car slowed as they approached the station, a squat brick building, its tinted windows as dark as the intentions of the men inside. They had done this before. They would do it again. The door yanked open, and hands pulled Malcolm roughly from the car. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of sweat, cheap coffee, and something sour. Desperation, maybe. The station wasn't built for justice. It was built for processing. Everything moved quickly, too quickly. Name? A bored desk sergeant asked. Reed. Malcolm. Charges? Possession. A pen scratched against a clipboard. No hesitation. No question of innocence. Just another name to add to their list. Malcolm lifted his chin. I want to speak to my lawyer. Boone smirked, leaning against the counter. That's cute, he muttered, shaking his head. A lawyer, in Blackridge. The sergeant chuckled as he handed over a set of keys. You'll get your call after processing. Maybe. Maybe. Malcolm clenched his fists. He knew the game. Delay the call, drag it out, make sure no one can help before it's too late. The cell was small, 8 by 10, a steel bench bolted to the wall, a toilet in the corner with no privacy. The air was stale, thick with the weight of time that had settled here. He sat down, rolling his shoulders, trying to shake the stiffness in his arms. He wouldn't panic, wouldn't let them see even a flicker of fear. He just had to last until morning. But then he saw them, lined up in cells along the corridor, dozens of men. All waiting, young, old, silent, and all of them were black. One man caught Malcolm's eye, late 50s, gray in his beard, hands clasped together like a man who had run out of prayers. Their gazes met, and for a moment, neither looked away. The man exhaled slowly. Then, barely above a whisper, he spoke. First time? Malcolm hesitated. Then he nodded. The man gave him a sad, knowing smile. Won't be your last. The word settled in Malcolm's chest like a stone. Because that was the truth of Blackridge. Once the machine got hold of you, it never let go. Malcolm barely slept. The fluorescent lights in the holding cell never dimmed, and the restless murmurs of the other men, low voices muttering prayers, curses, quiet pleas for a second chance, filled the air like a hymn of the forgotten. By morning, the machine was ready to move him to its next stage. They came for him before the sun had fully risen. No warning. No time to prepare. His case number was called before he even saw the inside of a courtroom. Before he could process what was happening, he was already seated at the defendant's table. The room was small, windowless, built for speed rather than scrutiny. The wooden benches were worn, as if decades of restless defendants had dug their fingers into the grain, clinging to something. Hope, maybe. His wrists were still cuffed. That told him everything he needed to know. They had already made up their minds. Across the room, perched high on the judge's bench, sat Victor Langston, a man who had presided over this court for nearly 2 decades, and in all that time had never once ruled in favor of a black defendant. Not once. His robe was pressed, his expression unreadable. But Malcolm had studied men like Langston before, men who wore the illusion of fairness like a well-tailored suit. Langston flipped through the case file, barely glancing at him. "Let's move this along," he said flatly. The prosecutor, a wiry man with slicked back hair and the disinterest of someone handling routine paperwork, rose from his seat. He didn't argue. He recited. "Your Honor, we have before us a clear case of illegal narcotics possession. The defendant, Malcolm Reed, was pulled over for a traffic violation, during which officers discovered a plastic bag containing a white powdered substance beneath the passenger seat of his vehicle." He paused. Not for effect, but as if waiting for the next line of a well-rehearsed script. "The evidence is clear, Your Honor. The state requests that bail be denied." Malcolm barely heard the rest, because none of it mattered. This wasn't a trial. This was processing. His attorney, a court-appointed stranger who had met him only minutes before, offered nothing in response. No objections, no arguments, just empty nods and stolen glances at the clock. Malcolm clenched his jaw. "Your Honor, I was in a meeting in the city during the time of the alleged crime. I have phone records, credit card transactions." Langston exhaled sharply as if the interruption had inconvenienced him. "That's not relevant," he said, waving a dismissive hand. "The drugs were found in your vehicle." Malcolm opened his mouth to protest, but the words caught in his throat. It didn't matter. This court didn't care about proof. It only cared about process. Langston glanced at the bailiff. "Next case." And just like that, the machine moved forward. The gavel hadn't fallen yet, but Malcolm already knew how this would end. It didn't matter that the evidence was planted. It didn't matter that his alibi was solid. The machine had already decided his fate. The prosecutor had stopped looking at him. His own lawyer hadn't even pretended to care. Langston barely glanced up from his papers. "Does the defendant have anything else to say?" A final formality. A rhetorical question. Malcolm straightened his spine. His voice was calm, steady, louder than the silence pressing against his chest. "I need to speak to the U.S. Attorney General." The words sliced through the courtroom. For the first time that morning, everything stopped. The prosecutor blinked. The court-appointed lawyer finally lifted his head. Even Langston hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. Then, a shift. Boone, standing near the back of the courtroom, went rigid. The smirk he had worn so easily flickered, strained at the edges. Langston's fingers tensed against the armrest of his chair. His eyes, calculating, assessing, finally focused on Malcolm. "Excuse me?" Malcolm didn't repeat himself. He didn't need to. Because suddenly, for the first time since this trial began, they were listening. For the first time since Malcolm had stepped into this courtroom, the machine hesitated. A beat of silence. Then another. It stretched longer than it should have, thick and unnatural, as if the entire room had momentarily forgotten how to breathe. Judge Langston didn't move. Neither did the prosecutor. Neither did Boone. Malcolm saw it, the first flicker of uncertainty in their carefully rehearsed performance. This wasn't in their script. Boone's smirk had vanished. His hand hovered just above his belt, fingers flexing, then curling into a slow fist. The prosecutor, who had been casually tapping a pen against his legal pad, suddenly stopped. His shoulders tensed, as if he had just realized he'd been holding his breath. Langston's grip on his gavel tightened, knuckles pale against the polished wood. His eyes narrowed, not in authority, but in calculation. Then, movement. A uniformed officer near the back of the room shifted uncomfortably. His fingers twitched at his radio. He hesitated, just for a second, as if waiting for someone else to act first. Then, without a word, he turned and slipped out the door. No rush, no sudden movements. just a quiet, deliberate exit. Malcolm followed his silhouette through the glass-paneled door, watching as he reached for a phone the second he was out of sight. A call was being made. Malcolm didn't know who was on the other end, but Boone did, Langston did. And for the first time since this trial began, Malcolm wasn't the one who looked like a man with something to lose. Hundreds of miles away, in a sleek, glass-walled office overlooking Washington, D.C., Elijah Reed sat behind his desk, flipping through a case file when his secure line rang. He answered on the second ring. "Mr. Attorney General, sir." The voice on the other end was controlled, but there was an edge to it. Hesitation. Elijah leaned forward, immediately sensing something was off. "Go on. We have a situation. Your brother has been arrested in Black Ridge, Georgia." Time stopped. Elijah's fingers tightened around the receiver. His pulse remained steady, but the weight behind his silence spoke volumes. "For what?" His voice was calm, clipped, dangerous. "Drug possession, sir." But a pause, a tell. Elijah didn't need to hear the rest. He knew exactly what this was. He inhaled once, slowly, exhaled. His mind moved quickly, assembling the pieces. Then his tone shifted. "Get me everything. Now. Every record, every officer involved, every case that courthouse has handled in the last 5 years. I want warrants on my desk within the hour." He stood as he spoke, already pulling on his jacket. "Sir," the voice on the other end hesitated. "Should we notify the FBI?" Elijah's answer was immediate. "Not just the FBI. I want the Bureau of Justice, the Civil Rights Division, and every federal investigator within 200 miles in Black Ridge before sundown." A pause. Then quieter. Deadly serious. "And make sure the press knows exactly where they're going." Within minutes, the wheels of power began to turn. A chain reaction set off by one phone call. Federal agents mobilized, FBI teams deployed. Black SUVs tore through highways, helicopters lifted off. Reporters scrambled, newsroom phones buzzing with the kind of tip that could bring down an empire. And as Black Ridge went about its morning, still believing itself untouchable, the storm was already coming. Judge Victor Langston had spent 20 years controlling the tempo of his courtroom. Not today. The moment Malcolm spoke his brother's title, the air had shifted. Langston could feel it. So could Boone. They weren't the ones pulling the strings anymore. Still, they weren't about to lose control without a fight. Langston cleared his throat, masking his unease behind the weight of his gavel. "Mr. Reed, this is a court of law. If you wish to make a call, you will do so at the appropriate time after sentencing." Malcolm met his gaze, unflinching. "That's not how this works," he said, voice steady. "You don't get to decide that." Langston's jaw tensed. This was spiraling too fast. He turned to the prosecutor. "Motion to expedite sentencing. Let's move this along." The prosecutor hesitated, then nodded, playing his part. "Your Honor, given the evidence presented, we request immediate sentencing." Denied. The voice came from the back of the room, slow, commanding. Langston turned sharply, eyes narrowing as he spotted the officer who had slipped out earlier, now standing just inside the courtroom. His radio was still clipped to his shoulder, the red light on, active. Listening. Boone stepped forward, voice low. "Judge, we need to shut this down, now." Langston clenched his teeth. He had spent years making sure no one questioned him in this room. And now with one name, one phone call, the walls were closing in. "I am the presiding authority in this courtroom," he snapped, forcing steel into his voice. "And this trial." Then the doors burst open. 2 men in dark suits strode in first, flashing Department of Justice badges. And just like that, it was too late. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom slammed open, sending a sharp echo through the chamber. The room froze. Every head turned as 2 men in dark suits strode in first, their badges flashing under the harsh overhead lights. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Their voices carried through the tense silence like a judge's gavel. Final. Unquestionable. Behind them, more agents poured in, some in black windbreakers marked DOJ, others carrying briefcases that held something far more damning than handcuffs. Evidence. For a long, stretched second, no one moved. Then, Langston recovered first. He straightened in his chair, gripping his gavel with forced control. His face wasn't calm, it was calculated. "This is a court of law," he said smoothly. "Unless you have jurisdiction." One of the agents cut him off. "Judge Victor Langston, we are executing federal search and seizure warrants under the authority of the Department of Justice. Effective immediately, you are relieved of duty." The words landed like a gunshot. Malcolm saw it, the flicker of fear that Langston tried to bury beneath years of authority. Boone's reaction was sharper. The officer took half a step back, eyes darting toward the exit, sweat glistening at his temple. His fingers twitched near his belt, not in defiance but in instinct. A man who suddenly realized he was prey. More agents were already moving, passing through the rows of spectators, heading straight for the judge's bench. Another group turned toward the prosecution table. "This is outrageous," the prosecutor sputtered, pushing to his feet. His hand shot out, gesturing wildly toward Malcolm, toward the defendant's table, like a drowning man reaching for anything to keep himself afloat. This man was found with drugs in his vehicle. The lead agent dropped a thick, bound folder onto the table. It hit the wood with a weight that wasn't just physical, but damning. "No," the agent said, voice steady. This man was framed, and this court knew it. The prosecutor's mouth opened, then closed. Because in front of him, in front of everyone, was something far worse than an accusation. Proof. Page after page. Tampered evidence reports, altered timestamps, internal memos detailing exactly how cases were handled in Blackridge. Names, dates, a blueprint of corruption, signed and sealed by the very people now scrambling for an escape. Langston gripped the arms of his chair, his nails pressing into the polished wood. Boone's breathing had turned shallow, his fingers now clenched into tight fists. Malcolm let out a slow breath. It was over. And for the first time in decades, this courtroom belonged to justice. The weight of the evidence had already sealed their fate. But the moment the FBI agent reached for his cuffs, reality set in. Judge Victor Langston, the man who had ruled over Blackridge's courtroom with absolute authority for decades, was about to hear a verdict he couldn't control. "Victor Langston," the lead agent announced, his voice crisp. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, obstruction of justice, and multiple civil rights violations." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Langston stiffened, his face locked in a mask of defiance, but his hands trembled against the arms of his chair. The gavel, his symbol of power, sat useless on the bench. "You can't do this," he barked, his voice cracking. The agent didn't flinch. "You have the right to remain silent, Your Honor. I suggest you use it." Langston's breath hitched as the cold steel of handcuffs snapped around his wrists. A judge in chains. For the first time, he wasn't the one passing the sentence. Boone had been watching from the sidelines, eyes darting for an escape, but there was none. Two agents stepped toward him. "Lieutenant Travis Boone, you are under arrest for perjury, falsifying evidence, and participating in an organized criminal enterprise." Boone's jaw tightened, his face twisting into something between fury and fear. "This is bullshit," he spat, jerking his arms as the cuffs locked into place. But even as he struggled, he could hear the unmistakable click-click-click of cameras firing. Because every lens in the room was pointed straight at them. Journalists, reporters, photographers, all capturing the moment the enforcers of Blackridge's corrupt system were finally brought to justice. And it wasn't just the media watching. Across the room, a handful of uniformed officers remained standing by the walls, frozen between duty and self-preservation. Then, one of them, a younger deputy with nervous eyes, stepped forward. He hesitated, then swallowed hard. "I'll testify." A murmur swept through the courtroom. Another officer, an older man, someone who had spent years under Boone's command, exhaled sharply and nodded. "Me too." Boone whipped his head around, eyes blazing. "You little." "Enough." The agent holding Boone's cuffs tightened his grip. Because it didn't matter anymore. The Blackridge machine was collapsing, and no one was going down with it. The fall of Blackridge's most powerful men was only the beginning. Within hours of Langston and Boone's arrests, federal agents spread across the state, executing search warrants, seizing records, and uncovering the full scale of the corruption. What started as a single case unraveled into something far bigger. Judges, prosecutors, high-ranking law enforcement officials, even state politicians, all of them were connected, a web of corruption that stretched far beyond this one courthouse. By nightfall, breaking news alerts flooded national television. Federal investigation expands, widespread corruption in Georgia's judicial system uncovered. Private prison kickback scheme exposed, lawmakers implicated. Thousands of convictions under review after DOJ crackdown. The evidence was undeniable. Leaked bank records showed illegal kickbacks flowing from private prison companies into the accounts of judges and law enforcement officials. Emails and internal memos outlined quotas for wrongful arrests. More bodies meant more funding, more money funneled into corrupt pockets. And worst of all, case files dating back over a decade revealed a pattern of racial profiling and fabricated charges, destroying countless innocent lives. The machine had been running for years, unchecked, until now. By morning, grand jury subpoenas were issued across the state. High-profile names that once commanded respect were now scrambling for legal defense teams. Some resigned in disgrace before they could be arrested. Others tried to strike deals, offering information in exchange for leniency. But the message was clear. No one was untouchable anymore. And as the sun rose over Georgia, the foundations of a system built on injustice had begun to crack. One arrest at a time. Malcolm stepped out of the courthouse into the crisp evening air. The weight of the past 24 hours sat heavy on his shoulders, but he didn't let it slow his stride. Not now. Not after everything. Reporters swarmed the steps, shouting questions, shoving microphones forward, desperate to capture the man at the center of the storm. He ignored them. His eyes swept the chaotic scene. The flashing cameras, the agents escorting prisoners into black SUVs, the stunned faces of townspeople who had once believed justice would never come. Then his gaze lifted. Past the courthouse, past the town, toward the horizon. Because Black Ridge was just one place. And this fight was far from over. Malcolm stepped out of the courthouse into the crisp evening air. The weight of the past 24 hours sat heavy on his shoulders, but he didn't let it slow his stride. Not now, not after everything. Reporters swarmed the steps, shouting questions, shoving microphones forward, desperate to capture the man at the center of the storm. He ignored them. His eyes swept the chaotic scene. The flashing cameras, the agents escorting prisoners into black SUVs, the stunned faces of townspeople who had once believed justice would never come. Then his gaze lifted, past the courthouse, past the town, toward the horizon. Because Black Ridge was just one place, and this fight was far from over.